Test 1, 2. Test.
Da, odlično. A?
But here, well, there are two hand microphones. You need one?
Bitte? Ach so, okay.
It's open on the hand mic. Is that okay?
Ah, okay. Ja.
Well, thank you very much for coming back from the coffee break to the second session of our conference, which I have the pleasure and the honor to moderate. We will also certainly continue the discussion of some of the issues which we had before. I heard already that the issue of industrial policy will again also be part of this afternoon debate. Actually, what we do now, we come to the, let's say, the basis of what led to the recommendations of the first panel, meaning the research, the country studies, the comparative studies, the analytical work, which accompanied us in these 2 or 3 years of intensive debate. And allow me also to underline that this particular process of debate which we had was really something outstanding, even for somebody who had a long experience in this type of discussion. So we really had a process, and even if it appears that there are 10 policy recommendations, we have at least as many opinions within the debating group as we have personalities present in it. We have this session now with one presentation and one comment. The presenter is Professor Milica Uvalic. She is professor at the Economic Department of the University in Perugia. You held different other jobs, including you were a member of the Gingic government, if I'm not mistaken. You have published endlessly articles and publications on Southeast Europe, on globalization, on the challenges for development, and especially in the economic sector. Milica Uvalic will present the results of the study, which is included in this publication, and which has a strong comparative component. Following, we will have Dr. Will Bartlett. He is Senior Visiting Fellow at the London School of Economics, lecturer on development economics and comparative economic systems in various universities. And I saw that you yourself described your focus of research as the political economy of economic and social development in Southeast Europe, and we are very much looking forward to sharing your experience and opinion on this issue. Allow me briefly to say something about me. I'm just a sociologist. My expertise is not in science and research, but I have been working with the Friedrich Ebert Foundation, I think, in 9 countries of Southeast Europe, and I was living in 5 countries, so I have a kind of, let's say, the practitioner's expertise in work of developmental cooperation. Yes, so let's start with Milica, but let me just say that in one of your publications is called Learning from the Past. Which of the past current development strategies are best suited to deal with the quadruple crisis? And I think that I'm hopefully sure that after your presentation we will have some more answers to this statement or to this question. So you have the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Michael, for this kind presentation. I have to say that I feel really honored and privileged to be able to talk and present the main findings of our project in reference to specifically Southeastern Europe, the Western Balkans. I'm also very pleased that most of the members of our working group have actually made it to Belgrade. Not all, but most members that have contributed to this project are here. Since we have been meeting all over the Balkans, but this is the first time that we actually meet here in Belgrade. Now, my presentation will be mainly based on the study that Vladimir Cvijanovic and I prepared for this regional study, but of course it's also based on inputs of individual country reports, on our long discussions, and of course, since the study was written some time back, I simply had to update some of the figures. So some of the figures that you will be seeing are actually updated figures of some of the graphs which are included in the study. We all know that the Western Balkan region has had a particularly difficult 30 years of transition and economic development. And so in this study we have tried to actually answer some of the main questions. Why is the Western Balkan region lagging behind? Why have similar policy prescriptions that have worked better, that have worked in Central and Eastern Europe, not actually delivered in the Western Balkans? And what can be the remedies? At this point, of course, it is extremely important to find some solutions in order to speed up and accelerate economic development. And in this regional study, I thought it would have been important, and in fact that this is what we have done, to include various issues. It is important to understand some of the long-term problems of the Western Balkans, and that is why we actually start from the situation in the region in 1989. We discussed the 1990s, we discussed the 2000s, and so on. And it's a long paper, but I will try in the 25 minutes that I have been given to actually cover most of the issues. Next slide, please. Well, just reminding what the region was in 1989. There were only, actually, if we exclude the other countries in Southeastern Europe, but there was Yugoslavia and Albania. And there is no doubt that Yugoslavia at that time had excellent starting conditions regarding level of development, trade with the Western world, decentralization, and so on, in comparison to Albania. I also thought it would have been important to remind what was done in Yugoslavia before the breakup, Ante Markovic's government, but even before, because that is how, in fact, we have the start of the transition to market economy. But as you know, there were many problems, not least the tremendous political disputes in the country at that time, which actually led to the breakup of the country in June '91. And of course, some of these problems were inherited by all the successor states of Yugoslavia, and then we see a notable divergence in the transition paths. Next slide. Very briefly, we know that the transition in this region was delayed by three groups of factors. The political events, we know them, the breakup, the NATO bombing, military conflicts, and so on. Inappropriate economic policies, including the neglect of very important transition-related reforms. Some countries moved faster than others. The earlier reformers are usually considered Albania, Croatia, and Macedonia. Bosnia and Herzegovina and the Federal Republic of Yugoslavia were, of course, lagging behind because of political problems. And the third group of factors which we have to take into account is the hostile international environment. At that time, of course, there were many political problems, and that is why we see that also EU policies in support of the transition in this region come a decade later, only after the end of the Kosovo War. So the 1990s have been a decade of marked political and economic instability, and this has left tremendous and very deep economic consequences. So that is why I thought it would be important to recall what was happening. Next slide. Next slide. Okay. So we come to the 2000s. We see that things are changing. There are many positive developments. Of course, this is due also to political changes in some key countries in the region, but also to different international strategies. We finally have a long-term strategy for the Western Balkans launched by the European Union, the Stabilization and Association process. And until the outbreak of the global crisis, we actually see a major improvement in macroeconomic performance, a relatively strong growth, declining inflation, some fiscal consolidation, and a very fast increase in foreign trade, and acceleration of economic reforms. We all know that, but also some policy failures. And of course, these policy failures are debatable, but if you look at the statistics now, after 18 years, you will see that some of the countries have actually expanded the private sector fairly slowly. There's been no effective competition policy. The business environment, of course, countries that have advanced on the doing business, World Bank doing business indicators, but still there are some areas where the situation is not satisfactory. Another big point are rising trade and current account balances. In fact, imbalances. We see that trade has been rising exponentially after 2000, but exports have regularly been half of imports. And in fact, just before the global crisis, we see that these countries really had tremendous trade and current account deficits, and this is certainly linked to the fact that they were not able to export enough to the global markets. I have to mention the problem with the structure of FDI. I've done some work on that. We see that a large part of the foreign investment that came to the region was actually in the non-tradable services, which actually serve the domestic market. So somehow FDI has not helped so much reorient, did not help much reorient exports towards the outside world. So limited restructuring of real sector of the economies. Next slide. I also have to add that these years of relatively strong growth were sustained very much by inflows of foreign capital from abroad, also by credit boom, loans from the bank, foreign-owned banks that had been privatized in the meantime, that actually extended a large amount of credit to households, to firms, and so on. And then comes at that time it seemed that things were moving in the right direction, but then came the global economic crisis, and in the last quarter of 2008, we see that all countries were very deeply hit by the crisis, both through the financial channel and the real channel. We see reduced inflows of foreign capital, a credit crunch on the part of banks, but also reduced export demand for the products they were exporting before. And in 2009, all countries actually enter a deep recession or experience a very strong growth slowdown, as in the case of Albania and Kosovo. And in the following years, we have double-dip recessions, even triple-dip recessions in the case of Serbia. Serbia has had 3 negative growth rates in these last 10 years. Increase in unemployment, many social problems, increase in poverty. Serbia is, according to some indicators, actually the country in Europe that has the highest Gini coefficient on inequality. And if we look at the last 10 years, growth record in the last 10 years, we see that, of course, there is a recovery in growth after 2014, 2015, but growth rates are actually still not, they have not returned to the pre-crisis levels. Strong economic integration with the European Union during the period 2001-2008 has undoubtedly helped economic recovery of the region, but then these countries became also much more vulnerable to external shocks, and that's how they were very badly hit by the economic crisis. Next slide. So this is a graph which actually gives updated figures on the effect of the crisis on economic growth in the region. And we see that growth, GDP growth, is picking up these last few years. But still, the level of GDP growth rates has not reached the pre-crisis level. Not only, but if we compare the average growth rates in the Western Balkans and in Central Eastern Europe, the new member states where also Croatia is now, of course, included, we see that the Western Balkans have actually had half of the average of Central and Eastern Europe. And of course, this is what really makes us worry. It means what was mentioned also by Dusan Reljic. There is a risk of not being able to converge to EU income levels. Next slide. So the crisis also brought up, revealed a number of structural problems of the Western Balkan economies. I'm sorry that I've been repeating myself with these structural problems for many years. Some of you have heard this already, but first of all, external imbalances. Very strong external imbalances because of lack of sufficient competitiveness on world markets. Exports were not rising enough. Labor markets, jobless growth. This is something that was present also in Central and Eastern Europe, but in the Balkans, it really acquired much higher proportions. The third main problem I see in the very rapid structural changes. These countries have become service economies, but somehow too quickly. They have gone through a process of very extreme deindustrialization, not only in the 1990s as the Central East European countries, but some of these processes have continued also in the 2000s. There's been very slow reindustrialization and, fast increase in services. And when you add up all these problems, you actually see that in terms of economic development, in terms of where these countries are now today, they're actually at a very low level of development. I've prepared a few graphs just to show you, to illustrate these problems. Next slide. So this slide illustrates the slow integration into global markets. These are, this is comparing 2005 with 2016. The exports of the goods and services GDP ratio, and we see that some countries have actually done relatively well. If you look at Serbia, we see that in a matter of 11 years, it has doubled its openness, its degree of openness, but still, altogether, there have been, we see that the Western Balkans are actually much less open still today than the new member states, or at least most member states. Of course, there is a country like Romania, it's a big country, but generally that's the conclusion. Next slide. And what is even worse, if we look at the structure of manufacturing exports, and this is actually, I borrowed this slide from Bonomi and Relitz's recent paper, we see that the structure of exports is extremely unfavorable. We see a very small percentage in the high skill and technology intensive sectors. We see that a lot is being really, the lot of the exports are actually in these lower quality, lower labor intensive and medium skill intensive sectors. Next. Labor markets. Now here these are very known issues, but in the Western Balkans, the problem of unemployment and low employment are really long-term issues. We must remember what was happening in the 1990s, because many countries that today have the highest unemployment rates actually have had them also in the 1990s. So if you look at the employment rate, this is of course comparing to the EU 28. It remains low. Today in Europe, we are striving to reach 75% employment rates by 2020, but the Western Balkan countries are really lagging behind. Similarly with the unemployment rates. I do have additional two graphs, next slide please, which show also the long-term unemployment rates and the youth unemployment rates. And I think these figures are really alarming, because they show you that in fact the long-term unemployment rates are 3-4 times the long-term unemployment rates in the European Union, while the youth unemployment rates are equally alarming, precisely because we have extreme problems with employment of young people, well-educated young people who are actually leaving, who are migrating because they're not able to find jobs in these countries. Next slide. So, third main structural problem regards the fast process of structural changes towards services, and we see that in fact the Western Balkans have gone through a process of extreme deindustrialization. This is a graph showing the situation in 2015, and just note Serbia is a bit below 20%, but all the other countries have a share of manufacturing value added much lower. The new member states have really managed in the meantime, especially during the 2000s, to reindustrialize and have very high shares of, relatively high shares of manufacturing, but there are also some of the old member states that actually have high, for where manufacturing is important, including Ireland, Germany, Austria, and so on. Next slide. Now here I wanted to actually compare the situation before the crisis in 2008 and 2016. And here we see that, in fact, there has been some reindustrialization, but very little. Look at the situation in the Western Balkans. We see that, in fact, Serbia and Macedonia have increased slightly the share of manufacturing value added, but in general, this graph also confirms that they are less industrialized than the other countries. Next slide. And here I come to the most alarming issue, which regards very low levels of economic development and very slow convergence to EU income levels. You know that the Western Balkans are at about 29 to 45% of the EU average. Kosovo is not included. Kosovo is even less developed, but Eurostat still does not publish figures for Kosovo. And therefore, we really have a risk of convergence. We see that especially in the last years, after the crisis, some of these, if you look at the Western Balkans, Albania, Bosnia, you see that in fact they have been growing very, very slowly. Next slide. And this is another rather alarming graph, which actually compares the level of real GDP with the level produced in 1989. And we see that until recently, now things have a little improved, but there are two countries, Serbia and Bosnia and Herzegovina, that have still not reached the levels of GDP in 1989 by 2016. Of course, I have added the Central East European countries here just to show the big difference. The Central East European countries really managed to get out of the transitional recession fairly quickly, while the Western Balkans were again bombed by various problems, and that's why we see various setbacks in growth also in the second half of the 1990s. So after having a decade of very low GDP growth, it is not surprising that they're not able to catch up. Next slide. So, current challenges. I hope I'm doing well with time. I'm rushing through all these issues, but part of it is also in the distributed materials. The key issue is now, of course, how to accelerate economic growth, and the region is actually facing very specific policy constraints. If we think of macroeconomic policies, on the one hand, we know that monetary policy cannot be used or is of little use. There is the official use of the euro in Kosovo and Montenegro, or there are very rigid exchange rate regimes, but in any case, euroization is widespread in the whole region. Fiscal policy is also constrained by the austerity packages that have been imposed on a number of these countries. The exceptions are Kosovo and Albania. But I do want to note that public debt GDP ratios are not so high. If you look at the public debt GDP ratios in the Western Balkan countries, they're still lower than the average in the EU 28. And of course, this is not to say that they should allow a great increase in. But if you look at countries like Bosnia, Macedonia, Kosovo, public debt remains still below 60%, if I'm not. And therefore, I think that fiscal consolidation and fiscal policies are at best controversial. Of course, it's a debatable issue, but you see a high GDP, the public debt GDP ratio does not mean that a country will necessarily face a fiscal crisis. Anyway, I think that probably something could be done in this sense. What is very alarming is that all these countries have very low investment and savings rates. Investment measured through gross fixed capital formation has actually been a declining share of GDP these last 10 years. Also in some countries, Serbia, this is very well illustrated in Jure Bajc's paper, actually has very low public spending. Public investment is extremely low. Not only, but domestic savings are very low, and this means simply that these countries have to continue depending on inflows of foreign capital. They have to continue depending on inflows of capital from abroad, despite the fact that in these last few years there has been an improvement regarding the trade and current account deficit. Croatia, in fact, has had several years of positive balance. Next slide. So these are investment, to what I have already said. Investment rates have been declining, been a declining share of GDP. Next. This is, however, even more alarming. I have looked for the most recent World Bank data on domestic savings, gross domestic savings, and here we see that the domestic savings in most of the countries are extremely low. So in comparison to the Central East European countries, 26%, the EU 28, which is at the level of 24%. Macedonia has an 18% savings rate, but the other countries are really do not, or it's not being registered. I really don't know how to explain these, otherwise they must be the true picture of the region. Next. We do see declining trade and current account deficits. Trade deficits have declined, and I have to say, at least studying some of the countries, that it is due to an increase in exports rather than a decline in imports. Next. And here, in fact, I was wondering whether some of these countries have actually arrived to the moment of being able to change the growth model. And this isn't actually what I've just looked at these data. We see that, in fact, exports have been increasing quite quickly after the crisis, in the case of Serbia especially, but also Croatia, Bosnia, whereas imports have been cut after the strong impact of the crisis, but then they remain fairly stable. So perhaps this export-led growth could finally arrive to the region because it has not been there all these years. Perhaps it is time that things move for the better. Next slide. But FDI remains still very important for covering current account deficits. FDI did not return immediately to the region, but now we see that it is picking up. It is still not at the level, at the peak reached in 2007, but this graph actually compares the current account deficits, the red part, in percentage of GDP with net FDI inflows before the crisis, 2007, 2008, and the average after the crisis, 2009, 2017. So we see that, in fact, it's interesting to observe how, in fact, current account deficits really depend a lot on the inflow of FDI. Next. In the paper, we also stress some of the other long-term policy failures. I cannot go into all this, but of course, these failures, which are in part linked also to political issues, have really burdened these countries additionally. If we think of the political constitutional problems in the region, I think all the countries have had serious problems in almost all countries. Then, if we think about the growth strategies and the transition strategies that have been implemented very frequently, it was based on neoliberal prescriptions. Some reforms have been postponed. And as already stressed by my colleagues before, there are certain sectors that have certainly been neglected and that have to become priority sectors to be supported in the future, including agriculture, energy, environment, research and development, education, innovation. And of course, last but not least, we know that the institutional and legal environment is still highly unsatisfactory. Next. Next. So, coming to my conclusions and recommendations, some things have already been said by other speakers in the first session, by Jens and Max. Effectively, I think we need different policies at the national, regional, and EU level. So regarding the national level, I think we need to reflect on a different model of economic development, which would take into account not only the economic, but also social and environmental issues, which are unfortunately still today not taken sufficiently into account, including redistributive policies to combat inequality, unemployment, poverty, some of the things that Minister Tavdesky was emphasizing. And we do need effective pro-growth industrial policies, more targeted towards key national priorities in line with comparative advantages that would enable technological upgrading, that would enable the diversification of the industrial base, that would enable more innovation, better quality FDI. It's not only a matter of having more capital in these countries. You have to somehow steer the foreign capital towards those sectors that you regard important. And so I think that there is a fundamental role to be played by government institutions, by government agencies, and I think this is where I think in most countries we have had very strong, very important failures. Next. At the regional level, of course, some of you who know me, I've always been a big advocate of regional cooperation. Clearly, these countries have to intensify regional cooperation because it's important. They're very tiny, they're small economies, and there are many issues that depend on the size of a country. FDI does not depend only on government policies, whether governments offer tax incentives or whether they are going to improve the business environment. They also depend on exogenous factors like market size, economies of scale, and so still today, fragmentation is a big handicap. Of course, this is what is exactly being done now through the Berlin process, through the Regional Cooperation Council, everything that is being done to create a regional, more integrated economic area is on its way, but trade and interlinkages in the region still suffer because of trucks that wait on the borders that cannot pass because of bureaucratic procedures. And finally, my last comment is on EU. On the EU, of course, given that these countries are still at a low level of development, that they have very limited internal financial resources, that FDI as a source of growth, as a source is, of course, very volatile and risky. I mean, if you look at the annual figures of FDI, you will see that it's very unpredictable. I think I very much support what Bonomi and Relic have been writing in their papers over the last 2 years, that the EU really has to think seriously the problem of economic development of the Western Balkans by increasing what it is giving to the region much before membership. Because from now, we're in 2018, who knows when the first countries will actually enter, whether it will be in the form of structural funds or named differently or the Juncker investment plan. More money has to pour into the region. That would actually also, at least in part, compensate the risky FDI, which I think has not really delivered as well or not delivered what these countries were expecting. So I'm stopping here. I hope I haven't talked too long. And then, of course, we can return to some of these issues afterwards in the discussion. Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Milica, for this crash course in social-economic development in the region. With a lot of data, with a lot of interesting conclusions. I am sure that this is a good fundament for continuing the debate which we started in the first session on the policy recommendations, and you had added some dimensions to it as well. So I'm really looking forward to our discussion. But first, I would very much like to ask you, Dr. Bartlett, to give you a comment, and is there anything which you have to add to this panorama? Is there a particular focus you would like to put on one or the other issue? We are very interested to hear your contribution based on your experience.
Okay, thanks very much. Yeah, I mean, I thought that was a great presentation. It's remarkable panoramic view over several decades, comparing 6 or more countries and a whole host of issues, not least both macroeconomic and microeconomic issues. So, it really is a lot to take in. And I'd like to just focus on 3 points, really, 3 issues raised in your report. The first 2 are about the nature of the current economic situation and how it's developed over time. First being the problem of external imbalance, point out, and the second being the question of deindustrialization. I think they're the 2 big themes that come out of this report. And then your policy recommendations. I think the big policy recommendation, which is also covered previously in the previous session, was this idea of industrial policy. I mean, this has been a sort of taboo subject for a couple of decades, probably, in the region, as you say, with the dominance of neoclassical economic theories and policy approaches, which have emphasized very much that the state should get out of the way and allow the market to spontaneously follow its own path. And the idea that the state and the bureaucrats in the state can't really make good economic choices, really up to the business sector to do that. So industrial policy has been off the agenda for quite a long time, so it's quite sort of probably a good moment to bring this back into the discussion. Because neoclassical economics is now sort of less in the ascendancy following the economic crisis, financial crash, that was not predicted by that type of economic theory, and that brought the whole economics profession to some extent into disrepute. So there's a lot of discussion in the economics world about what should be the sorts of theories, economic theories, and what should be the sorts of policies which we should think about in terms of recovering from that great shock to the global system, to Europe with the Eurozone, European system, and to the Balkans. As you say, point out, Western Balkan countries have been very badly affected by that crisis. Although just on one small digression on that point, you had a chart here, I don't think appeared in the report, about the GDP level relative to 1989. Serbia and Bosnia still haven't caught up. But what you didn't mention was that the second country towards the top is Albania. And Albania is now 200%, twice the level of 1989. So the question is Albania doing something right that the other countries should be learning from, or is this just a facet of their very low initial starting position, and therefore not very remarkable? It looks rather remarkable, but that's one question. So anyway, so these 3 points, external imbalance, deindustrialization, and industrial policy. Well, you showed very convincingly that there are external imbalances in these countries, but then all countries have external imbalances. Some have a positive current account deficit, surplus, and others have current account deficits. And, does this matter? Why should we be worried about this? In fact, it might even be good if you've got a current account deficit, because it means that you have the capacity as a country to absorb more resources from the rest of the world than you're giving out. So it's actually a good thing, because you're actually better off than you would have been if you'd been autarkic, like Albania in the under communism, or even the Western Balkans in the 1990s, which were, in that period, were essentially trying to pursue a path of domestic-led growth, of not really engaging with the outside world, but trying to develop on the basis of their own resources. And then in the 2000s, we moved into this era of globalization, hyper-globalization, leading up to the crisis. The Western Balkans got involved in that. And that was the time at which the banking system in the Western Balkan countries was taken over by the EU bank. If you look at the proportion of assets owned by the banking systems in each country, you see it shot up from practically 0 to practically 100%, in a space of very few years. And then the crisis came, so maybe that was a good thing. And the Sickle is still here. I don't know. He said, keep control of your banks. Keep control of your banks.
Well,
and
Slovenia did something different.
And Slovenia did that. But they were still hit by the crisis, so but recovered quickly. Okay, anyway, external imbalance. So current account balance, what does it consist of? It consists of various components, and one of the components which you drew attention to is the trade balance, and that's the export and imports of goods and services. So, let's take, for example, Serbia in 2017. Current account balance of minus 6%, trade balance minus 8%, and a deficit in goods export net of goods, taking into account both exports and imports, of minus 11%. So you're absolutely right to point this out. I mean, this is actually a huge deficit, and it's because it sort of reflects this thing about lack of competitiveness, inability to export goods onto the mainly European market, but also the world market. So that is a feature, Then if you look at the services component of that, the services balance was plus 3%. Okay? So that's actually, if you think, a deficit is bad and a surplus is good, then something's going on well in the services sector. So services are not, they're not unproductive. They have a purpose in economic life like every other commodity. Okay, so that's the picture on the trade balance. But there's two other components in the current account. There's the so-called primary income, and there's a so-called secondary income balance, which go to make up the balance of payments. And the primary income balance is the income earned from factors of production. So land, labour and capital abroad, what you earn from those, or what foreigners earn from you and go abroad. And this mainly refers to, because land is not traded internationally very much, labour is not actually traded internationally very much, but capital is traded internationally. And this is the return to capital. So this is the dividends from capital. And in Serbia, it was minus 7% of GDP, negative outflow of dividends from foreign investments made in Serbia. So this is, if you look at Ireland was the picture you had on your exports of goods and services, absolutely fantastic surplus in Ireland, 30% or something like that. And they have an absolutely massive outflow of dividends because they have huge foreign investment. But the foreign investments that are going into Ireland are producing goods and services which are being exported because they've got a positive surplus on goods exports. But the foreign investment that's coming into the Balkans, or into Serbia in this case, is not generating competitiveness, not generating exports. It's generating an outflow of dividends. And I think that's an important point to think about when we think about external imbalances, because it's not just imbalances on trade in goods and services, therefore a story about competitiveness, which then leads you to want to have a policy to improve competitiveness, such as cutting wages, making labour more productive, whatever. But it's also a story about an outflow of resources to abroad related to the foreign investments and the sale of the domestic industries to foreigners, which is not being used productively. And then the secondary income is the other aspect of this current account deficit or surplus. And that's essentially payments that are just made unrelated to income factors of production, and it mainly relates to remittances. There are other flows as well, but in Serbia in 2017, this flow was positive 10%. So it means that all that outflow of dividends was more than covered by the inflow of remittances. And I think that's something which should be taken into account as well. So that's sort of a good feature in a way, but it reflects also the outflow in previous years of skilled people abroad who are sending money back to their families, which is perhaps a negative factor. Okay, so deindustrialization, you pointed out that deindustrialization has taken place, although there has been some little recovery in the last 10 years or so. So it's not an ongoing process, but compared to the past, there's less industry now than there used to be. Now the question is, why is this important? You know, why do you say that services, development of services, there's too many services, too much services, and too little industry? And of course, the point is that the reason I'm raising that question is that services contribute either directly to exports, as we've seen there's a surplus of exports on international trade, or indirectly to the manufacturing goods that are being exported. For example, telecommunications. In order to export manufacturing goods, a chair, you need to be able to communicate with a foreign buyer. For that, you need efficient telecommunications. If you want to sell globally into the world market, you need export finance, you need banking. So you need all these services in order to make your manufacturing industrialization work properly and be productive. And moreover, in recent years, the world economy is moving more and more towards the digital age and the internet. And this is all about the increase of production of services. It's the services economy that we're moving towards, a digital economy. And if you look at the penetration rates of the internet in these Balkan countries, you see there's been a fantastic change over the last 10 years. From very, very low levels of penetration 10 years ago to now about 65% of households being linked up to the internet. And it's approaching EU levels, 85%, something like that. And there's still some way to go, so this can be improved even further. And this is where the new future economic development is going to come from. It's going to come from the digital economy. And it's going to come, for example, in Belgrade, there's a company, a new digital startup which produces online games, which has become apparently, highly successful. Employment in that company is growing and its market is booming. So that's just one example of what might happen. So, turning then to, have I got something? Turning to industrial policy. Okay, so the diagnosis is there's deindustrialization, therefore we need to sort of reindustrialize, therefore we need an industrial policy, which I sort of agree with. I think, despite everything I've said, that manufacturing industry is the sort of the productivity generator of the economy. You wouldn't really get all these services supplying the manufacturing industry if the manufacturing industry wasn't there in the first place. So you need manufacturing. And when it comes to industrial policy, you can break this down into sort of three types of policies. One is the vertical policies, where you are targeting, as you say in your report, particular industries or particular companies, and you're what used to be called picking winners, and you invest in those, and you provide subsidies. And this was a sort of policy which was so successful in places like Taiwan and South Korea in the 1970s and 80s. And this is where this idea has sort of lingered on into the current discourse. It has been successful in the past, but, and there's two problems with it, there are other places where it has been spectacularly unsuccessful. Because, as I said at the beginning, government bureaucrats are not very good at picking winners. And apart from that, even if that wasn't the case, you immediately run up against EU state aid rules. Because state aid is prohibited to companies to provide them with a specific advantage on the market. So it's very difficult to see how you can actually implement your proposal of this sort of vertical, targeted industrial policy. So that leaves us with two other options, horizontal policies and place-based policies. Now, horizontal policies are the ones which are actually being applied throughout Europe at the moment. They're compatible, they're allowed under state aid policies. They're about giving expenditures, allowing expenditures for R&D by companies, giving subsidies to R&D, subsidies to the small businesses across the economy, and other sort of horizontal measures which don't sort of favour particular industries or sectors, whatever. That's all EU compatible, and that is being even implemented in the Balkan countries to some extent, especially through EU programs. And then we turn to place-based policies, and I think this is where the interesting action comes and where your proposals might feature. And within place-based policies, you've got three different types. You've got the traditional place-based policy, and by place-based I mean in a location, in a less developed region. So regional policies. You've got traditional regional policies where you have subsidies to industries in those regions to help develop them. Then you have a very specific place-based policy in what are known as special economic zones, which are sort of free trade zones where you have special advantages given to the companies that are located in those zones. And this is being applied already in the Western Balkans, particularly in Serbia and Macedonia. And there are 14 free trade, free zones in Serbia, which have attracted 260 foreign companies, from which the exports are booming. And this is why one of the reasons why your exports in Serbia are shooting up. And this is to do with the subsidies that are given to those foreign companies. And equally in Macedonia, you have the technology, industrial development zones where companies have 0% profit tax. They have a €500,000 subsidy to build a factory, all sorts of huge subsidies. And then the third type of place-based policy is so-called smart specialization, which is the latest sort of buzzword in EU regional policy, the idea of developing the domestic economy in the direction of digitization and high-tech industries and new fast-growth startups. And that's not related to subsidies, particularly. It's not related to special economic zones, but it is related to trying to mobilize the indigenous resources in specific localities. And I think that's a much more sensible approach, because traditional regional policies based on subsidies are expensive and wasteful. And this is, in fact, in Serbia, the Regional Development Fund has this sort of subsidy policy towards foreign investors, and they're giving €5,000 per job created, this sort of thing. It turns out that 10,000. It turns out that actually, if you look at the investment, the average investment made by a foreign investor in Serbia is around about €5,000 or €10,000 per employee. So actually, the Serbian government is actually paying for the foreign investors' investment in this country, from which they then derive dividends, which are then flowing out back to the home countries. So, I mean, it's like a sugar rush, really. You've got a huge boost of exports, but it's not really having a big impact on the domestic economy. It's all based on subsidies draining the public budget, which is the deficit is increasing as we speak, in a way. So that's what I say. I would say that how can these policies be improved? I've just got 4 ideas really here. One is that the foreign investors which are being attracted, I mean, if you're going down that route, if you're going to have subsidies, traditional subsidies or special economic zones, it needs to be embedded in the local economy. So you need to be creating linkages with local businesses who are going to be supplying the companies in the special economic zones. At the moment, lots of those foreign companies are importing the intermediate products from abroad, a little bit of processing carried on, and then they're exported again. So there's no spin-off, there's no additionality to the local economy. So it's very important to build up the local small industry to supply the foreign investors. I think you mentioned this in your report, and I think this is absolutely critical to future development. And then you also need to upgrade the skills of the labour force locally. I mean, there are some of these special economic zones where there's already labour shortages. I think the one in Subotica, the special economic zone there, has Now, it hasn't got it, can't find enough workers locally. They're bussing in workers from all around Vojvodina because there's not enough local skilled people. So that points to the need to boost the education system and create links between industries, the foreign investors in the schools, which is already happening in some instances, but that could be boosted. And then I would agree, there needs to be a regional approach to this. At the moment, all the countries are sort of competing against each other with lower and lower tax rates and bigger subsidies. That should stop. And finally, just I think the smart specialisation idea is quite a good one. It's supported by the EU, and it could be a way to sort of leverage EU funds into the local economic development.
Thank you very much for this very interesting and supportive reflection on the dimensions you mentioned and related to the issues you discussed, including your recommendations and comments to your presentation. I think what we should make use now of the remaining time is to open the debate and include as many of you as possible into this discussion. I would ask that you pick only 1 or 2 issues and not try to answer to 10 or 15, so that as many as possible have a chance. Just a second. I want to know whether those who have been, who wanted to speak in the first session, still believe that that it fits into the actual debate. If we now recall them, I don't know who was it, but there were 2 or 3. It was you from the first session? No, for now. Okay. Well, then Milan, start you, and then we then continue to the other.
Milan Živković from FES Skopje, and it transcends from the first and the second session as well, because it actually deals with the foreign direct investments and with some of the issues that Milica Uvarić actually pointed out in terms of the brain drain and the unemployment rates. It actually, all of the recommendations as a social scientist and also as an economist, those two don't have to cancel each other out, but are really good in terms of the work that we as FES do in this region. But on top of everything, I think not much was talked about the diaspora and the role that it actually has, other than the remittances that are being actually sent back to the country. The brain drain that we talk about and the level of entrepreneurship that a lot of the immigrants from the Balkan, from this region, take on in the respective countries where they, respective host countries, whether that's Germany, France, Scandinavian countries, United States, Canada, Australia, and their role in terms of investing back in the countries. We all know what our deficiencies are. We all know the level of, or the lack of investment from the diaspora in our respective countries. And there has to be a way to actually improve upon that. Minister Tevdovsky actually left, but one of the points that the Macedonian government has actually introduced in the last 12 months is actually on top of the subsidies that are being given to the foreign direct investments and the small and medium-sized businesses from Macedonia, they're actually giving an additional 5 to 10% for the business or the investments from the Macedonian diaspora. So that's an additional effort that's been done. But just to add on to this, in the last few months we've had the ability and the pleasure to actually research some of these other examples, and we noticed that the examples of diaspora investment funds in Armenia and Greece are really giving some positive yields in terms of including the diaspora, including the businesses and the entrepreneurs that are coming, that have roots from these countries, and giving back to the community. Lack of trust in the governments is actually giving way to these investment funds being created by the diaspora, managed jointly with whether that's economic experts from the local countries or maybe civil society. So that could be another approach that could be taken into account for on top of these recommendations that are already given, which me personally, I think we as an office in Skopje, we believe that's, they're really done you've done a tremendous job as experts. So.
Okay. Thank you. So please, who else would like to? Okay. You first, and then you over there. Is the microphone for the lady, please?
Aleksandra Vladisavljević. I'm a member of the Women's Platform for Development of Serbia, but I'm also an entrepreneur. And I would like to thank you for bringing the word failure to this region, because we really failed, and this is what we feel, but somehow we are not saying very often that we failed in terms of the economic policies, and this is really healthy to hear. On the other hand, the truth is that there are many things that are not functioning, and you have listed them all, but there are also things that are good, and somehow they're missing from the picture. So I would like to say that I was waiting to hear for the entrepreneurship. It wasn't mentioned even once, the word entrepreneurship. And also the micro businesses are not actually also recognized, because 90% of the Western Balkan economy is basically micro firms. And the research and the studies that are present, they show that they don't grow. And it's not because they don't know how to grow, because, okay, I can say I'm not maybe that successful as an entrepreneur, but if the entire economy is not successful.
Just.
Okay, so what I wanted to say is that if those firms are not growing, it means that we have structural problems, and the removal of these problems is key, like as a policy option. On the other hand, innovations are mentioned, but not really emphasized that much. I would say that we really need an ecosystem for innovation, not only technological one, but the social innovations as well, and the policy innovation. So these are the areas that are maybe even more important than attracting another foreign investment cycle or finances, because there are some funds here, but the question is how the money is spent, the money that we have at the moment. And also there are many untapped resources, both physical and resources, the human resources, that are totally unused. So how to create all these linkages between these good things that we have, and then of course to add what is missing. But it's never black and white. There are so many colors in between. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Can I respond?
Okay, please, yeah.
Oh, I fully agree with all your comments, but obviously I was not able to go into too many issues in a 25-minute presentation. There is a lot going on. I did a study with a colleague of mine from Belgrade last year, precisely looking at SMEs, small and medium-term enterprises, to see the problems in Serbia, and in fact it is the SME sector that is being most productive and most export-oriented. It's the most innovative firms in Serbia. So I've done research on this. I didn't mention it today because this was a presentation on the whole region. There are things that are developing in a very positive way, not only, but if you look at the IT sector in Serbia, it was mentioned also by Will in reference to the importance of services. I fully agree with what you have said. In these last 3-4 years, Serbia has actually had an enormous increase in exports of IT services, and that is one of the reasons why, in fact, it has managed to increase its exports abroad. And so I fully agree. Innovation, of course, the government in Serbia is supporting innovation, but with a very tiny amount of money. I think much more must be dedicated to these issues because, of course, there are talents. There's a lot going on now, especially now in these last few years, but somehow it's not being recognized enough. And I think the problem is also of coordinating all these various measures into one coherent development policy, if you want, of a country. And somehow, I think this is really missing. A long-term vision of where we want to go, what should be done, and fortunately, at least now, since 3 years old, there are these economic reform programs that have been imposed on these countries on the part of the European Commission that are forcing governments to reflect on their longer-term priorities. There is a need to prioritization, and in fact, this is what is being done recently, and this is very positive, I think. I don't see that much has been achieved so far, but let's wait and see. And smart specialization, especially. There's this unit at the European Commission, science, that actually is pushing countries to go in the direction of their, choosing those sectors which where they can be, where they can, in fact, develop better, and so on. So I do know about many of the positive elements, but it's impossible to cover them, especially because the situation is different. I know Serbia best, so, but it's impossible to, well, there are many things going on in all the countries, but it was impossible to cover many of these issues.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's one of the important points of this discussion, that one has to move much more into detail of the situation in the different countries, see the good and interesting examples. Yeah, I didn't forget him, yeah. Okay, that's not...
Okay, hello, my name is Aleksandar Matkovic. I'm a student of philosophy. Thank you all for your expositions. I wanted to ask a question on the first panel, so I'll just address it now, and there's some also questions for you, actually comments. First of all, I'm going to follow up on what Dusan Raljic has said in the first session regarding the role of the EU in Serbia, and actually just going to read a couple of names of a couple of banks that have been closed before and during the crisis. There's the Jugo Bank, the Investment Bank, Srpska Banka, Novi Sad Bank, Bell Banka, Vojvođanska Development Bank, and also the Novosadska Banka. These are, of course, not the only ones, but these were the domestic banks that have been closed down, including the development banks, before the crisis. And then when the foreign banks came, it was not a coincidence that there was a credit crunch and that there was actually a rise in the risk of debt towards the overall population. So this is not a coincidental thing. So Dusan Raljic mentioned only some of those, but I think there's also a second financial-oriented aspect that we are, I think, forgotten, didn't mention. Those are repo operations, repurchasing agreement operations, whereby because of the difference between the benchmark interest rates of the EU and Serbia's own high interest rates of the National Bank of Serbia, foreign banks, which have been instituted after our own domestic banks have been closed, were gaining huge profits upon speculative investments and gaining off the differences between two benchmark interest rates into our economy. So what this then created was inflation and an over-accumulation of speculative investments. And this is not a coincidental thing. It's also not a small thing. I think I got also some statistics in 2005. The profit of these repo operations was 16 billion dinars. In 2009, it was 151 billion dinars. So it's all soared into the crisis. And now, coming to what has been said regarding institutionalizing the development banks, well, we already had those and then we lost it because of speculative investments. So this is something I think needs to be addressed, because these operations, while they have dwindled in amount, they're still continuing on today. And this is not only because of Serbia's own economy, but actually because of its relation to the EU and European economy. And this also has, in turn, huge consequences upon any idea of wage-led growth. So how should we institute any wage-led growth if we have this financial bubble basically hanging up on our threads and creating debt, creating inequality, creating consequences that are here for the overall population? So this should be, I think, addressed. Also, this actually goes hand in hand with the outsourcing of production. And of course, I think all of you know at least this, there's something called Regional Cooperation and Development Agreement between the EU countries and Serbia and EU accession countries. This has opened up also our automobile industry, including Fiat, who has actually been here producing cars and producing, cars based on subsidies, as has been said just now. And I think these two links, these two things, the repo operations and the outsourcing of production, which actually, depend on subsidies, are the two things that are driving basically our own economy down. And it's not because of Serbia's domestic economy as such, I mean, like labor market problems, supply and demand problems, but because of precisely it's chained in to the European countries, to the core countries, that this is not just any sort of problem, but I think this is a really core problem. And I just wanted to outline this because I think the further discussion needs to be clear on these points. Another thing I wanted to highlight is the role of economic chambers that have been mentioned in the first papers. I think they were overemphasized. I still remember, to be honest, when some of us with the trade unions and activists in Novi Sad, when there was the first labor law agreement supposed to be released regarding the labor law, when we went into the Chamber of Commerce in Novi Sad only to get a stuck door in front of us, 300 people outside the building, the guys inside the Chamber of Commerce running to their limousines and fleeing the thing where they saw the general population in front of the building. This was supposed to be a public discussion on labor laws. That is how it happened. It was led by the economic chambers, and these chambers are not just only some private initiatives organized around private entrepreneurs, they're codified in law. You have the dual education law that has codified the economic chambers of Serbia as a mandatory thing in the law, because it needs to oversee the relations between the faculties and the young labor force, yes, who are also not the subjects of their own labor contracts. So we have basically students working, although they're not able to sign a labor contract, and the Economic Chamber of Commerce is actually overseeing this. This is its role. It's not a positive role, it's a negative role. I think this should be really addressed, because if we overstate these sort of positive changes in the region, I think we will overlook the problems that are actually, dragging it down. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Is there anybody else who would like to come in? We have time for one or two more contributions, maybe from the expert group who are present here would like to add something. If not, I would ask Milica and Will Bartlett to make a kind of effort to...
Okay, well, first, of course, I have to say that I agree with many of the comments that Will has made regarding external imbalances. Of course, there are many countries in the world that have huge current account deficits, including the US, etc. The problem is if the current account imbalances continue increasing, because the country has to cover them in some way. Either you have to have positive balances on some of the other accounts, or you have to decrease your official reserves, or you have to increase indebtedness by taking new loans. So the real problem is if this increase in the current account deficit becomes unsustainable, because the country is no longer able to pay off its debts and so on. So nothing bad in having, of course, there is a critical, perhaps 7% threshold when over 7% having it becomes alarming. But of course, the main issue, the largest part is the trade balance. So it is linked to what a country is able to export in terms of goods and services and so on. There was a question about Albania that Will raised. How come that Albania is really on top? Of course, first of all, Albania was the poorest country in 1989. And not only, but it had, automatically it had higher growth rates than the other countries, but not only, it did not have military conflicts. It did not have the tremendous political problems that all the other countries have had. So it's not surprising to see that this has done well in terms of growth, which does not mean that it has done well in terms of institutions, et cetera, et cetera. In Albania, some problems are probably much worse than in the other countries. Regarding the financial issues, I think that what is really a big problem for the Western Balkans, we have not written it, but is that financial integration really went very fast. It went too fast. The financial integration between the region and the EU, whereas real sector integration has not happened, actually. When we think of the history of Europe, we actually first had trade integration, integration among the real sectors of the economy, and then financial integration actually came only in the 1990s with the internal market program and liberalization of financial flows, but this was actually happening only in the 1990s. In the Western Balkans, we see that there was a too fast financial opening up and integration, and therefore, of course, a strong increase of vulnerability to external shocks coming from through the financial sector. Yes, smart specialization we've already mentioned. I think that some of the countries, we heard some of the measures that Macedonia is presently implementing in order to attract the diaspora, and of course this is very important. The UNDP has been active in some countries, also in Albania, but perhaps the other countries could learn something from present Macedonian policies, because of course diaspora is a huge value, and so I think I've commented on most of the issues.
There was this issue of entrepreneurship. I think that was not yet, but it's up to you if you want to make another comment.
Yeah, I mean, I think that entrepreneurship and innovation are key points that are related to this idea of smart specialization strategies. I mean, what a name you call it doesn't really matter, but there is a sort of EU infrastructure behind that name. That's why I'm sort of mentioning it. And the idea there is to, as I said already, to try to develop local regional economies by, and I think you mentioned linkages. Yeah, I think linkages are terribly important. The linkages between small businesses and between industries and the education sector. And I would just say that the Serbia and Macedonia have put a lot of effort and money into attracting foreign investment, which has been, in my mind, the biggest story in economic development in the Balkans in the last 3 or 4 years. I mean, that is a game changer, I think, because it's integrated these countries into the global motor car supply chains. And now Serbia and Macedonia are producing highly advanced motor car components, which are being sold throughout Europe, catalytic converters or whatever it might be. And the point is that these are sort of islands of excellence which are dotted around the place. And Montenegro and Kosovo and Albania are looking at this experience, and they are trying to reproduce it. So they may have the same experience in the future. But at the moment, it's just Serbia and Macedonia. And I think the key thing there is an opportunity which is not going to last, because these firms will disappear in 10 years. They'll go off to another desirable, highly subsidized location. In the next sort of 5 or 10 years, to really embed all that technology into local economies by trying to upgrade the local capacity of small businesses, entrepreneurs, to supply those foreign investors in that particular industry. And if you're going to target one particular industry, I wouldn't target agriculture or energy particularly. I mean, you've already got an agricultural policy, but I would target the motor car industry. That's where the investment is at the moment, where the opportunities are.
Thank you very much, Melissa Velic and Willy Bartlett, for your participation in this panel, which really indicated and showed that the complexity of the issue we are speaking about. So we were not so happy as in the first panel where we had 10 policy recommendations, but we saw the entire complexity of the issues and even added a couple of things which needed more let's say, attention and also reflection. I think, anyhow, this shows that we are in a process of debate, and that, as the Minister said in his contribution, we should not stop here. Actually, this is part of an ongoing process, which hopefully continues in what way or the other. We have the documents, we have the research, we have the reflections. I just tried to calculate how many people participated in various of these public debates. I must be about 300-400 if we add this from all the events. And it's not up to me to thank all the participants of that group, but I think that this word from Minister Tedowski that we should not stop here is certainly something which we could agree on. Max, you want to say something at the end? As the host, I see that there's another point on the program.
I couldn't say no to this invitation to say something for the end. I guess it would be appropriate to thank you as the audience and all those that have been participated from our steering committee and the authors, and Will Bartlett as a guest and expert to comment on this. Thank you very much. We will not stop here, as it is also just my beginning of term in Belgrade. I hope I can continue also with the topic of economic growth and how to organize it in the region. I would like to invite you to stay a little bit longer. We have the opportunity to continue our exchanges over a drink, and I hope you all took away something from this and learned. And if you didn't take away something from it, there are still some publication outside on the table. So thank you very much, and thank you for coming.